Welcome back to Wages and Employment at Wilfrid Laurier University. Today we are going to introduce our neoclassical supply and demand model of the labor market, but notice we will be returning to this later on in our course. For reference, you should pair this video with reading chapter 1 of your textbook. So what we want to do here is set up a simple framework that helps us think about what is happening in the labor market. Like other markets for goods, we see a set of prices and quantities in the labor market. The main price we're interested in is the wage rate, and the quantity is the amount of labor or employment. These are the key outcomes that we pay attention to. Now, on the supply side, we are thinking about how individuals are selling their labor in the market. So we make a lot of behavioral assumptions. For example, we assume people want to be as happy as possible. That's what utility maximization is all about. And we assume there is at least some time constraint. In other words, there are only 24 hours in a day, and as humans, we just don't have the power to change that. Now, with that in the background, we create a supply curve, where each point on that curve is going to represent an optimal choice of labor supplied at each possible wage rate being offered in the market. Now, on the demand side, we're thinking about how firms are purchasing labor, and they're using it as an input in their production process. Now, again, we have some assumptions about what motivates a firm. We assume that they are seeking to maximize their profits. And with all of that in the background, we can create a demand curve where every point on that curve is going to represent an optimal number of labor or laborers demanded for each possible wage rate. Now, in that neoclassical model, we assume there is perfect competition in the labor market. And what does that mean? Most of all, that means that there are many, many buyers and sellers of labor. And as long as there's many of them out there, they don't have control over prices. They are price takers. We also hold all else constant. Basically, the curves that we create are going to show an optimal response in a particular context. We're keeping the world all the same otherwise. Now, when we look for our equilibrium, we want to look for what wage and employment combination is going to prevail at the end of the day. Just like our models for goods and for the goods market, we look for the prices that clear the market. We want supply to be equal to demand. Here, the wage that results in that equalization of supply and demand, that's going to characterize our equilibrium. Now, we present this model in a very familiar supply and demand diagram. If you're in economics, you've seen this type of diagram many times by now. The supply curve here is representing optimal choices for those selling labor, that's the workers, and demand represents optimal choices for firms. Now, on the horizontal axis, we often refer to employment here, but really this could represent a more refined measure for quantifying the amount of labor in the market. We could talk about how many hours people are working, or maybe just some more general measure of labor effort, although that tends to be a bit more abstract and difficult to measure. Now, in this perfectly competitive market, where those two curves cross, we have the same amount of labor supplied as demanded, and the market clears. Anyone searching for a job at W star in this diagram can find one. So W star is going to characterize that equilibrium as our market clearing wage. N star here is the employment level associated with that. Now, you can get into that thought experiment and say, well, what if the wage was higher than W star, say at W prime in this diagram? This is a situation where there is excess supply, and since there's workers out there who are willing to work at a lower wage, and there's firms who are willing to hire them, wages would get bid down. What if we considered a lower wage? Well, then there's firms who are willing to hire at a higher wage. They're looking for more workers, and workers willing to come in if that higher wage is offered. So wages would get bid up. So in this perfectly competitive market, we'd always move to W star. So what are some of the implications of this model? One is that when we see two groups of workers, perhaps working in two different sectors, is what we're going to show here, we expect them to earn the same wages. This is restricted to the case where workers are homogeneous in terms of the skills they need to work in each sector, and we need to be able to transfer those workers easily across sectors without any training, for instance. Now, in this diagram, we see workers in sector B on the right-hand side are being paid more than workers in sector A. Okay, it's just the way that things have worked out to clear the markets within each sector. So what's going to happen from here? Well, the folks over in Sector A there are going to look over and realize they could earn higher wages elsewhere. Okay, so they're going to move over to the other sector to seek out those higher wages. They're going to leave Sector A. That's shifting over their supply there. Now they're going to move over to Sector B, so supply has to shift right over there in our diagram. And as people move around and make themselves available in both sectors, the wages will adjust and eventually become equal in sectors A and B. Now, keep in mind, this is just in our perfectly competitive world with no market imperfections that would slow down this process. And, obviously reality is a bit more complicated. This would take some time. There may be many things preventing people from moving across these sectors. So it doesn't always reflect reality. Now, at a minimum, however, we should at least expect this to take some time. This model also implies that there is no such thing really as unemployment, at least not to the extent that people are searching for work at the offered wage rates. So at the market clearing wage, everyone willing to work at that wage rate is able to find a job. In this diagram, for instance, at W0, there are certainly more people who are willing to work up at that supply curve. But when we look at the demand for labor at W0, there aren't any jobs available, or not enough jobs available. So this is a case where wages would be bid down, eventually reaching that market clearing wage again. So if someone finds themselves unemployed, we tend to talk about it as though they are looking for a job at wages higher than what is being offered in the market, and we call those people voluntarily unemployed. It's a bit of an odd term that I think is misinterpreted in popular discussion quite often, but this is what economists mean by that. Now, labor economists are very aware that this simple neoclassical model does not depict reality, often in some very important ways. For instance, we know that wages do not adjust quickly. We know there are people unable to find jobs despite realistic wage expectations. We know there are often big differences in wages between workers who appear quite identical, at least in terms of the characteristics that should matter for their job. It's also important to recognize that wages aren't the only thing about a job that matters. You can care about how well you're treated, how safe your job is, and what other benefits might come with it. But more recently, it's become increasingly evident that many firms have at least some market power, and there are many ways in which the market fails. Final point to make here, all models are wrong, but some are useful. It's a nice little quote there, but really what we want to keep in mind here is that the models we are using aren't going to perfectly depict reality or frame reality, but it can help us frame how we think about some very specific problems. They don't have to be perfect in all ways to help us think about problems and find our way through them. So we're going to come back to this model in Chapter 7. But first, we're going to look more closely at all of the decisions underlying that supply curve. That's in chapters 2 to 4. And we're also going to think more deeply about the firm's decisions in chapters 5 and 6. Now, in our next video, we're going to take a look at current policy issues and think about how labor economists can offer some valuable insights in policy design. See you there.